Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Speaking of family life, we have a question that comes in. It says, what are some good books to read about family life? Now, a lot of people are very interested in family life these days, but it's sad. I'm sad. The books on family life today, most of them aren't any good. And I'm including there college textbooks. In fact, it's rather disconcerting. College textbooks don't really help people. You know, I have the old idea, maybe it's old-fashioned, but see if you agree with me. I have the idea if you take a class, pay money, go to school, go to college, that whatever you're studying, you should be better at it at the end of the course than at the beginning. Now, that may sound like a strange idea to some people, but anyway, that's my idea. That if you take a chemistry class, you should be a better chemist at the end of the course than at the beginning. A physics class, history class, economics, whatever. I have the same thought about family life. Family life courses, unfortunately, most of them don't seem to do that. I've been very disappointed over the years, except for my classes, of course. But textbooks are basically divided into two categories in this area. There's the textbooks that were written called functional textbooks. They are indeed to help people become better at whatever the subject of the book is. Then there are, in family life particularly, what's called sociological texts, written from the perspective of objective analysis and describing what is. In my quite a few years of teaching family life, I was well aware that the textbooks were becoming slanted, becoming, well, not really functional. The functional textbooks started just really disappearing. Publishers weren't presenting them, weren't making them available after the 1970s. Before that, oh, there were many excellent textbooks where people could read, could study, go to classes. For example, in the American Home Economics Association, the American Home Economics Association had many programs, and in home economics, people could really become, in my opinion, much better parents, much better spouses, husband or wife. At that time, in those years, very few males took the courses. But the girls and the women who studied home economics were, as a group, much better in family life for having done those studies. I think maybe there's today a third category of textbook besides the functional and the sociological. I think there's a sensational. Books that seem to be written basically just to expose every deviant and variant kind of lifestyle, all the problems, sort of like soap opera. And in my opinion, that doesn't help people become better at it. Unfortunately, the colleges in the main, you see, have taken the classes and the books like that and assume that you don't need any preparation to teach a course like that, and I guess that's true. If you just get together and wag with the students about, what kind of problems people have, you don't need any preparation. And so family life has been relegated to sort of the junk heap. It's a course that nobody needs really any preparation for to teach the way it's being presented today. And that's sad, very sad. There are some good books out there, but most of them are by religious publications. People who haven't given up the idea, that yes, the family is important, the family is meaningful, and should be. And written in a way to help people become better at living in families than they were before. So, you know, the Home Economics Association, I used to be a member. I never claimed to be a home economist, but I was a specialist in family life. And my doctoral studies were from Florida State University in the interdivisional doctoral program in family life. Part of it, you see, was in home economics. Part of it was psychology, part of it was sociology, and the integration of these fields. The American Home Economics Association in 1972 seemed to take a turn, and it was one of the leading groups going away from families. I was very disappointed. I was aware of it, I saw it happening. I was very disappointed, and I think it knuckled under to the feminist groups, the women's lib movement in a very nasty sense. Some things about the women's lib group, very positive, but some of it was quite nasty, and that was a group of it. Some of you remember way back then, about in the 70s there, when a certain senator almost got a bill passed. In fact, he did get it passed, which would have set up a child advocate in each community who would tell families whether or not they could do certain things and evaluate families in each community, a child advocate. Well, that sort of thing had so many ramifications, and it was sponsored in part by some of these, we suppose, well-intentioned groups. But President Nixon vetoed it. Now, whether or not you liked him about Watergate or anything else, the man had some values there about some things. I shudder to think what would have happened if we'd gotten into this child advocate back in the early 70s. Some of us were very much aware of it. We worked against it. And we're still getting the flack. But here comes another question about daycare, and it's related, but what's happening to daycare these days? And here's a peculiar thing. Whatever daycare does, it takes children away from the family. We think of it the other way around, don't we? But no, sometimes people use it simply because it's there. You ask the question, why do people climb mountains? Well, they climb it because it's there. If you have daycare services available, people are going to use it. If it's not available, what happens? Children are taken care of by the families. You know, it's a big business sometimes, these daycare providers. Good business. But the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development found that prolonged time in care, and I'm talking about very recent studies, prolonged time in daycare, child care centers, was not good for children, not good for the emotional development. We've known this for years. Some of the research being published, and some of the very best research coming out of the state of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania State College, Pennsylvania University, some of them very politically oriented and not allowed to see the light of day, that showed some negative results in daycare. Well, what we have is people who are growing up and learning to make fun of the family, like Ozzie and Harriet. And the Ozzie and Harriet idea is alive and well. A lot of people still think, well, that's a good way to have a family. That's a good way to rear the family. You know, you can go back and look at some old movies. They weren't videos in those days. Published by McGraw-Hill. Some of them are still around. Showing the family concerns, how the family pulled together, how the family was an integrated unit, and compared to what we see today about family life, it's really quite a difference. Daycare, it's not a good substitute for really a mother's love. Children need their mothers. Just no other way of saying it. Children need their mothers. Of course, they need fathers too. And the better father, the better the mother. The better the mother, the better the father. Two go hand in hand. Here's another question. Well, of course, it's family life, so this one comes into family life. It's what are the main problems in being a step-parent? It's not an uncommon question in doing some pre-marriage work, helping people prepare for marriages. The answer to the question, main problems, clarity of roles. Who are you? We have a lot of problems and they're being compounded because today so many people in the homes, they're not even married to the biological parent. You have somebody come in who's supposed to play the role of a step-parent. They're not legally the step-parent. They're not legally bound to the family unit. They're, well, extended stay visitors in the home. But you put that in the context of a child. What's a child supposed to do with somebody like that? Who has authority? Who has responsibility? Is the child supposed to mind this person? Is the child supposed to care about this person? Suppose the person's unlikable. I received a letter this morning, a very sad letter from a law guardian asking for assistance in trying to make some sense out of some family situations. Rather unusual law guardian, in my opinion, because he's really keenly interested in the welfare of the children. But the question about step-parenting, here are some of the logical issues. What name should the person go by? That may seem to be kind of a foolish trivia question. But no, what are you going to call this person? Mom, Dad? Treat him like a brother or sister? Call him Mr. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so? What are you going to call that person? What is the relationship supposed to be? Is this person supposed to be a friend, a coach, a teacher, a drill sergeant, a parent figure? What's this person supposed to be like in the family? Excuse me, what about the authority, responsibility? Sometimes the biological parent wants the substitute to have the authority but no responsibility. Sometimes the visiting person who's supposed to be taking the place of the parent wants authority but doesn't want responsibility. You know, I can tell you what to do, but don't hold me accountable. What are people supposed to be like? What's the advantage of being in a step-parent situation? What are the disadvantages? What's the biological parent really doing? Exchanging what for what? Clothing, housing, money, in exchange for what? These things need to be talked about. Sooner the better for teenage stepchildren. They need to be clarified. But they need to be discussed, and sometimes the family needs to discuss it and have a pretty good understanding before the step-parent role is officially assumed. And I can't go along at all with these situations where people just move in and out of homes. That to me is just not acceptable. Not only from a moral standpoint, but not acceptable in terms of what it does to the children. You can't keep from teaching children. What does it teach them? You have to weigh that very carefully. What is the relationship supposed to be? Now, the step-parenting situation where the biological parent has died, see, it has some of the same questions. Is this step-parent supposed to take the place of the biological parent? But all the same questions prevail. What is the role relationship? What is the person supposed to do? What's the person to be called? Sometimes children have guilt feelings if they call a new person mother or dad, because that's disloyal to the real mother or father. These are problems and they can be worked out. Most step-parents, actual and real step-parents, do a good job. They really do. People learn to love each other. They shouldn't be expected to love each other from the beginning. Some of us aren't very likable people. That's just the truth of it, isn't it? But most step-parents do a good job. Some of them, bad job. Some of them do a good job in spite of the biological parent. And we've all heard the stories of Hansel and Gretel and Snow White and Cinderella and all those people. They were stories about step-parents. Mostly stepmothers, weren't they? but there's a lot to be said for them. Some of the most famous people in history attribute their successes to a step-parent. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Let me hear from you about family life, of course. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Let's kick off today with a question that has to do with terminology. A person said, I hear two terms used lately, dual career and two-job families. What's the difference? Dual career families and two-job families. Well, a career usually involves much more and a deeper personal commitment to work, whatever the work is, than simply a job. It takes typically longer preparation. It takes training, such as in a professional career. And typically, a person in a career identifies with that work. For example, you say, well, who are you? And somebody says, well, I'm an engineer, I'm an architect, I'm Dr. So-and-so, I'm an attorney, I'm an accountant. Those are careers. Whereas people who are in jobs typically don't identify themselves that way. You ask somebody, well, who are you? Usually people don't say, well, I'm the janitor, I dig ditches, or I do this, or I do that. No, people who simply have jobs, or I work on a line, assembly line, they don't think of it that way. They don't have a personal commitment to the work. They're doing the job is something that one simply does to earn money. And that's very honorable. There's not anything wrong with it. But here's how the importance of the question comes up in terms of family life. People who are in careers usually devote much more time to the career than simply a job. A job, 8 to 5, 9 to 5, 8 to 4, midnight, whatever. At a very specific time. People don't take the work home with them. They don't think about it. They go and punch the clock, so to speak, and they do the work and they leave. People in careers, it's usually not that simple. They're usually thinking about it. They're taking it home. They're puzzling how it can be done better because it's the personal identity part of it. Well, here's the problem. Two careers in the same family, people who are married, that's full time. You take the career, the marriage, and then you add children, that's too much. Two careers in a family, a marriage, children, that's too much. There simply aren't enough hours in the day. It may sound strange, you see, but when people started creating careers, the hours in the day stayed the same. And it's just not enough time. Something is going to suffer. And people starting off in careers, they usually devote more time to it in the beginning than they will after they're well established. What suffers? The children. Or the marriage. There's a real problem about some of these things and what it does. You hear these super moms, these career women who are trying to be really good mothers. They're well-intentioned. Can't fault them for the intentions. Or super dads, people who have a career and they're trying to be super fathers, and boom, I know people like that who schedule their hours and their time and everything so that they have time for the children. Well, that's great. But there are a lot of people out there who can't do that. They seem not to be able to afford the time away from the career to also be a good parent. Some people won't like it, but the recommendation is, why not put off the career for the the mother at least, until the children are in school. It's hard to do two things like that. Full-time mothering, full-time career. You put it this way, in the not too distant past, typical career required a homemaker, full-time homemaker, could really make a good partner for a career father, and the children benefited. That was ideal situation. Well, you can turn it around. Have a full-time male homemaker. I don't think men make very good mothers, so frankly. I tried it. Probably as smart as most people. Yeah. I never could do some of the things in mothering. Just seems to come natural. I don't make a good mother. Never have. And I had to admit it. I just can't do it. Some people won't like that. Oh, what is he, some kind of male chauvinist or something? Well, Lieutenant Chauvin was a good old boy in the French army. But you have to face it. What's the priority in life? Get your priorities straight. What's your purpose? Dual career, dual job. Much easier if you're going to have marriage and family to have a two-job family where people simply go to work and they come home and they're free. Dual career family, that's much harder. Well, quit beating that one. Here's another question. What's human nature? Human nature, isn't that interesting? We all have it, but what is it? It's a set of behaviors that sets us apart from animals. Anatomically, we're very similar to some animals like cats and pigs and monkeys. But we have a very distinct nature also that's different. We have a spiritual side to us, a spiritual dimension that animals seem not to have. We also have the cognitive capacity to override our so-called animal instincts, our instinctive nature. It used to be verboten, it used to be absolutely unacceptable in psychology to talk about human instincts. I recall, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I was always a firm believer in instincts. Always have been. I guess I would be considered narrow-minded in that sense, that I had views, I had opinions about people. Yes, there were instincts. Whereas the latest psychology books would say there are no human instincts. Baloney. That's not true. So much of our behavior is pre-programmed. But we also have a side of human nature that overrides the instincts, if necessary. For example, now here's an instinct that most people won't quarrel about. One of the biological characteristics of mammals is that they are gregarious. Well, human beings are mammals. They like to be in groups. They like to be in herds, a herd instinct. Well, there are positives and negatives about the herd instinct. It's very safe to be in a group. It's comforting to be in a group. Support groups. There are a lot of people who are reaching out for support groups these days because they have the need. The negative, as long as you're in a group, you're not outstanding unless you become the leader of the group. And in effect, the only way to be a leader of the group is to be somebody different from the rest of the group members. So, that's a herd instinct. And the humans have a lot of it. Here's another one, suckling the young. The babies don't have to be taught to nurse. We used to have all kinds of fancy psychological jargon about that. But the baby will nurse, the baby will turn its mouth to nurse, to suckle. And we're finding what was well known thousands of years ago, that nursing the young was healthy for babies. The old clock keeps going around, doesn't it? The pages keep still coming up to the same old things. We have a mating instinct, a breeding instinct, a periodicity, fertility period, where people's behavior seems to change, their attitude seems to change at certain times. Of course, we have a cognitive capacity to override that. to override the instinct. The question, though, sort of reminds me of a question. The results were published 50 years ago. I remember the published author was John Sergiamaki, and he did some studies about cultural configurations. Basically, he was trying to say, what are these people in the U.S.? He was basically talking about the American culture, comparing it to others. What he found was that as a group, he found that there are distinct roles for men and women. Most people believe in that. He also found that happiness was attained for both men and women, primarily in marriage. He also found that people cater to the young and they want to extend childhood. They want to preserve the youth. We certainly see a lot of that, don't we? People run around coloring their hair and getting rid of wrinkles and doing all kinds of things to try to keep looking young. For a time, it's interesting turning around the other way. We also have a lot of people that go around trying to look older, but that depends on their age. If they're not old enough to vote and drink, they always want to look older. And once they hit there, then they start trying to look younger. But are those instincts? Is that part of human nature? It certainly seems to be. Old people should be respected. That's another one. Well, in the animal world, the old are not particularly respected. They're put in their place. Well, here's an interesting question. Sometimes I have to ask, well, what's the purpose of the question? What's the person really wanting to know? Excuse me, here's the question says, are there people whom you can't help in counseling? The answer is certainly. There are people that counseling is not helpful to them. And if it's personal, sure, there are people that I don't seem to be able to help. But some problems, when people have some severe emotional disturbances, some people, it's a hormonal imbalance. Some people, it's a central nervous system problem. Others, it's other kinds of chemicals besides just the hormones. And all the counseling in the world, the best counseling, psychotherapy, may not be able to reach these people. I'm thinking of a young man I saw about 15, 16, 17 years ago. Fine-looking youngster, a teenager, and he had a temper outburst. He was very athletic, a hard worker, conscientious, but he was referred to me for his adjustment. Apparently he'd had adjustment problems all through school. He'd been to every counselor around. Talking and visiting with this young man, I became impressed that there was another problem. I was thinking, well, other counselors who've seen him are probably as good or better than I am. Why didn't he get better? So I started looking to see what was the reason. I use him as an example because here was a youngster who was agreeable for counseling, but he'd been bounced around all sorts of different schools and relatives. I referred him with a working diagnosis of partial lobe seizures. It became clear to me that there was a central nervous system disorder. Well, the neurologist I referred him to called me and said, "It's unusual. This is the first time I've seen the diagnosis," I think I'm quoting him accurately, "made by a layman when it wasn't a court case." But the story, the merit of the story is that the youngster started getting proper medication. His behavior settled down. Of course, I know he's happily adjusted, married, father, doing well. But counseling wasn't going to help that. Counseling wouldn't have touched that problem at all. go back to the question, sure, there are people also who have problems that I may not know how to help. They're out of my field. There are also people who sometimes come around that I don't want to help. That may sound strange, but that's true. I don't want to help some people. For example, I call myself a Christian counselor, and there are people who want me to help them in some way that is not Christian. In my opinion, sure, my opinion, but that's my right. Sometimes people want me to help them get an abortion, for example. No. If somebody comes to me and wants to work on that sort of thing, I'll try to get some other alternative here. But I'm not going to help anybody stop the life of a child. No, that's just not what I do. And then there are tiny percent of the people where we have personality conflicts. Just so, but somebody may not like me, I may not like the person. Do I have that right? Unless it's an emergency, I don't really care. Then there are people who I may not know how to help them. And if that's true, I usually very quickly will tell the person, I don't have the slightest idea how to help you. But I'm willing to try. Maybe we can find out together. And usually when I'm straightforward and open with people like that, we do a pretty good job of finding out what the problem is. Well, until another time, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one. Hello, I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Starting off, question is about people who come for help, come for counseling, or need help, and the problems are just too big. Well, too complex, something like that. Sometimes a new approach helps. It reminds me of a woman who was referred to me one time by a local psychiatrist. He's no longer in the area. But I thought I knew the psychiatrist pretty well, and I presume he knew me pretty well. But I really puzzled, why in the world did this man refer this woman to me? Her problems were extremely complex. Just about everything bad that can happen to people had happened to that woman. I looked at the history, I went over it thinking, what does he expect me to do? It occurred to me, well, maybe he's just clearing his records, and maybe he was just referring her to me because he wanted to get rid of something that he wasn't being helpful to. And that seemed to have happened several times in this woman's history. But it finally dawned on me, before I ever saw the woman personally, that there was something in all of this history that was missing. That nobody that I could determine had ever talked or evaluated her spiritual life, her religious life, the dimension in her life. And first time I met her, I told her that. I was up front about the history. She knew her own history. She knew it very well. But I said, it appears to me that nobody's ever really talked to you about that side of your life. Well, I lucked out. She was very happy to share that part, said nobody had ever asked. And indeed, that was a part of her life that was very important to her. In about 3 sessions, I'm serious, about 3 sessions, that's all the problem. All these other problems seem to be put in place. Last I heard, at least, she was adjusting pretty well. And was it my technique? I just lucked out. But I lucked out in spotting something that other people were overlooking. Sometimes that happens. Well, here's a question. Comes up about people. People with young children often get involved. The question is, When is a good time to start teaching children to read? And the answer is rather simple. Start reading to your children from the beginning. And keep it up. Children enjoy the reading, and they enjoy the companionship, the closeness, the contact. Don't be afraid to put an arm around the child. Let the child sit in your lap, hug the child, and read that way. It's good for everybody. I'm amazed today in the books on children. Hundreds of books to teach a child to read. Most of the books, if you look at them carefully, some of them will have in the front, this book, oh, it's a great book, introduces 5 new words, or 10 new words, or a dozen new words. I look at that and think, well, the publishers have really made a fortune selling covers. There's not much in the books, but the cardboard covers that are covered over with fancy picture is supposed to sell the books. And I notice it even in schools. I go visit sometimes, look at the children's books, and they use a lot of different books. Oh, what's that supposed to be doing? Attracting the child to the book? I guess it's supposed to. But contrast that to some of the old-timers out there. I learned to read out of one book. Pretty good reader, I guess. I've read quite a few books since then. One book, I don't know how many thousand new words it had in it. Never did stop to count them. But one book, compared to the many books that children have today. Oh, I'm guilty of buying books for my children too, going right along with the trends. But I look at them sometimes and think, that's sad. A couple of my children aren't particularly good readers, even though they have good education. That's sad too, isn't it? You can even find teachers who can't read today. And that's even worse. But the secret about children reading, show the child you enjoy it. And that applies to most anything else too with children. If I want to teach a child something, if I enjoy what I'm teaching about, I probably can't keep the child from learning about it. It's contagious. Children want to learn what the parents enjoy. They'll do that. And I apply it to most anything, whether it's religion or business or work. Children want to learn also how to enjoy life. They come that way. Well, here's another question. It says, depression in old people was in the news lately. What do you think of that idea about depression in old people? Well, now that I'm one of the old people, I can answer the question from several perspectives. But back in the 1960s, American Psychiatric Association did a big study. I was part of that, and found that all over the United States, people over 65 years of age were being committed to mental hospitals with alarming numbers, and they were typically diagnosed senile dementia, cerebral arteriosclerosis, or arteriosclerosis with senile dementia. It was a very common diagnosis. It seemed to be almost epidemic. And studies were being made of mental hospitals. And I remember visiting one down here in New York State, although I was in Texas at the time, stationed in Texas. I visited Willard State Hospital down on, I think, Seneca Lake. It was strange. Well, in the hospital where I worked, and what was found in other places too, was so often these people who were being committed to mental hospitals really for warehousing, simply to be taken there and left to die, and most of them didn't have cerebral arteriosclerosis. This was a finding, particularly in the hospital where I worked, because we had an unusual, very unusual pattern. Every patient who died in the hospital had an autopsy. It was found that many people with a diagnosis of cerebral arterial sclerosis didn't have it. 4 out of 5 didn't have it. What did they have? It was found in a careful study that really most of them had depression. In their depression, they acted like they were demented. Their memory was not important. They weren't thinking about things. They were just sort of drifting along, getting worse and worse and worse as the days go on. They were having problems sleeping, problems eating. Depression, not dementia. Well, an outgrowth of all of that in the 60s, during the 60s, across the nation, the state started looking at these things and started passing statutes that people simply couldn't be committed to a mental hospital because they had a circulatory disturbance, arterial sclerosis, and that people couldn't be committed simply because they were old. Mental hospitals didn't need to be used for that. Treat them, typically got better. Treat the depression that old people have, it simply got better. Now this was in the 60s. Why would this make the news here recently? Just days, weeks ago, all of a sudden this thing becomes something as if it's brand new finding. Known about that. I thought we'd been working with that idea for a good long while. But it's interesting, isn't it? We should always look for depression in old people. Just look at it normally. Some people, I say normally, meaning people adjusting to age, sometimes that's depressing. Sometimes it isn't. Excuse me, the person's happiness in life, how the person looks at life is the key to it. Some of us don't think about age. Some of us don't think of it. In fact, I've taught gerontology and graduate and undergraduate courses, been a consulting gerontologist. I guess, unfortunately, it doesn't depress me to think about getting old. The alternative is a little bit sad, but I'd rather get old. Here's a question. And this sort of thing comes up from time to time. If I think someone is contemplating suicide, what do I do? Suicide. Well, answer first. Ask the person. Ask the person. Simple, direct. If the answer is yes, if the family members, well then try to help the person get help. Stay in touch. Follow through on this sort of thing. If the answer is no, then what have you done? Here's the idea. Asking people about suicide has never been known to cause suicide. So many people are reluctant to ask, thinking, gosh, if I ask a question like that, I'm going to drive the person into committing it. No. Suicide, unfortunately, is a problem that seems not to go away. The percentage of it stays about the same. It's more in certain age characteristics than others, and the lethality factor varies with age. In other words, the success of dying. But here's some simple signs to look for. Depression. Not every depressed person is suicidal, but most suicidal people have been depressed. Sleep disturbances, appetite disturbances, feeling despairing, feeling useless, helpless, hopeless. When you get those things, call that just triangle of despair. When you have a feeling of worthlessness, uselessness, and hopelessness, that's very sad. The person who feels that way is a good candidate to start thinking about suicide. Also listen to people, see how they relate themselves to the future. Some of them won't talk about the future as if they have no future. Sometimes the comments like it hurts to live, disturbances in the emotional adjustment, severe changes, hostility, how they express it, disturbance emotionally, how it's expressed, the lethality of these people that start talking about really serious things. I call that the suicidal triangle. American Suicidology Association calls it the suicide triangle too. Is what the person talking about deadly? Is a person disturbed, and is there enough hostility? It takes a lot of energy to kill yourself. And sometimes people are so depressed they don't have the energy. A profoundly depressed person is less suicidal than a person who is getting better, because it takes a lot of energy. You think about it. We have billions of cells in the body, and all of them want to live. Every cell in the body has the capacity to try to adjust. And you multiply that times a few billion. I don't know how many billion cells there are in the body. But there's a tremendous urge, drive to live. I often ask people, what part of you wants to die? And most people can't come up with an answer. If I say rather simply that I know every cell in your body wants to live, sometimes that's helpful to people, and they get a perspective. Most of the time, people don't really want to die. What they want to do is get rid of the pain they're feeling. They want to get rid of the pain, and as they think about it, their thinking is narrow and narrow, and they don't see alternatives. Most people are not really wishing to die. There are a few people. There are 10 kinds of suicide. And there are a few people who are really determined to die. More common, by the way, in old people. Those who really decide surcease suicide. But on the other side of the coin, here's the last question for this session. It says, are there people who are just plain unhappy? Yep, that's the answer. The people who have the habit of unhappiness. There's also people who have the habit of happiness. If you have to marry somebody, for heaven's sakes, have the good judgment to marry somebody who has a habit of happiness. If you have the habit of happiness, you just ride your own wave. Whatever happens around you doesn't seem to take away your happiness. There are other people who are the opposite. Regardless of what goes on around them, they seem to be unhappy, proverbially unhappy. And don't drown yourself trying to help a person who has a habit of unhappiness. It doesn't serve them, it's not going to serve you. Don't let somebody else's unhappiness drag you under. Unhappiness in people is often very manipulative. It manipulates those around them. That may not be the intention of the person at all. But most people want to try to help get the person happier. Say, hey, smile, do something. You hear that all the time. Well, I'll do it another time. Why don't you try? Pick up the habit of happiness. I'm Dr. John Middleton. This is Family Life in the North Country. Have a good one.